Hello. Another day of drama in Washington with news of the first charges in the Trump-Russia investigation. Another day this US presidency's been distracted by substantial legal problems. Is the law, represented by the special prosecutor Robert Mueller, now starting to drift dangerously close to the president himself? There were two bits of bad news for Mr. Trump. One, possibly the less serious, is that his former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and a colleague of his were charged with tax fraud and money laundering. Not good, and watch that space. But for now, the second bit of news is perhaps more dangerous, as it is directly relevant to the thing that really threatens Trump: his campaign's potential collusion with the Russians in trying to bend the course of the US election. A former Trump advisor, it emerged today, George Papadopoulus, has pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about contacts with a Russian professor who he knew was connected to the Russian government. Paul Manafort is the best known of the characters in the news today. He made himself rich by busying himself in Ukraine, helping the pro-Russian president Yanukovych. But he went on to help Trump, in fact, to lead his campaign. The charges today all relate to activity before he was working for candidate Trump. Money laundering and tax fraud they are, and all have been fiercely challenged by his lawyer.
He was seeking to further democracy and to help the Ukraine come closer to the United States and the EU. Those activities ended in 2014, over 2 years before Mr. Manafort served in the Trump campaign.
The difficulty for the president is that everyone expects there to be more. Special prosecutors often interpret their brief widely, and these indictments show Robert Mueller is no exception.
It's very unlikely that these are the charges that they will face. Prosecutors will often bring a superseding indictment. So they could face twice, three times this number of counts by the time they go to trial. This is just the start, not just for others, but for them.
Along with Mr. Manafort, a colleague called Richard Gates was also charged. But it is the third man that's raised most eyebrows today, 30-year-old George Papadopoulos. He's lower down the food chain than Manafort, but he was a foreign policy advisor and has admitted lying to the FBI about his Russian contacts. It turns out he was arrested in July and has now been cooperating with the prosecutor. The White House spokesperson tried to dismiss him as having little to do with the campaign.
It was extremely limited. It was a volunteer position. And again, no activity was ever done in an official capacity on behalf of the campaign in that regard.
The president's spokesperson shrugging off the Papadopoulos news today. His lawyer did the same. And of course, Mr. Trump himself, he tweeted, "Why aren't Crooked Hillary and the Dems the focus?" But as he likes to remind everybody, she didn't win and he did, which perhaps makes him a more interesting subject. Well, we've heard about the central characters in today's drama there, but let's talk to the BBC World Affairs correspondent, Paul Wood, who's been looking at this whole issue now for about a year, and in particular at Mr. Manafort's activities in Ukraine. And Paul, start with the news today. What for you sort of stuck out as most significant?
Well, there are three strands to the Russia story: money, politics and sex. The sex stuff concerns allegations the Russians have blackmail tapes of President Trump. Didn't hear about that today. What we did hear is allegations that Paul Manafort got paid a lot of money when he was working as a political consultant in Ukraine, which he then did not declare to the US tax authorities. This is the overarching allegation that Russian money in Ukrainian politics brought influence with Mr. Manafort, which in turn extended into influence with President Trump when he was campaigning for the office of the president. And this intersects with the political argument. We have a Mr. Papadopoulos, a junior part-time employee of the campaign, if you believe the White House press spokesman, who has admitted to having contacts with the Russians and lying to the FBI about it. So these two things, money and politics, are converging. Did money lead to political influence, and did that lead to collusion, cooperation with the Russians in the election?
Now, you have spent some time in Ukraine. You've been gathering there evidence and news as to what Mr. Manafort was up to there. Now, what have you learned there?
Well, the bad news from Mr. Manafort started in April 2016 when a page from a ledger belonging to the Party of the Regions was leaked, and next to Mr. Manafort's name was an amount of $12.5 million. He's always denied that that meant he got paid this money. But in Ukraine over the past week, we were able to meet with people who dealt with the secret internal Ukrainian investigation. Ukraine's domestic security service managed to infiltrate an agent into Mr. Manafort's operation. And they found, their agent found, and other sources tell them, that he was paid $600,000 a month over 4 years, $28.8 million to be precise. That is the funds detailed in one of these ledgers. They believe there are 2 further ledgers. So the sums really, in the words of one Ukrainian MP to me, are quite staggering. And the allegation is, you don't just get this for being a political consultant. This is for more, this is for influence.
Right. What do you make of the Trump defence today?
Well, the Trump defence is that it's all a witch hunt. In Mr. Manafort's case, I've spoken to him about this, not today, but earlier, and he says, he was just trying to bring Ukraine closer to the West, closer to the EU. He was getting paid as a political consultant. The idea he was some kind of Russian agent is nonsense. Now, Mr. Trump has trotted out this witch hunt line quite a lot. He is quite right that there is no evidence yet of a treasonous conspiracy, no evidence of collusion. But remember that intersection between money and politics. The investigators are looking at whether Russian money bought Trump real estate, and they are looking at meetings that Mr. Trump's own son had with Russian officials. So the same problems that Mr. Manafort is facing, I think behind the scenes, that's where the investigators are looking to when it comes to the president himself.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's assess the damage to the president a little more closely. Joining me from Washington is Susan Glasser, founding editor of the political news magazine Politico, and from Los Angeles, Charlotte Laws, author and political commentator. Charlotte, let's start with you. How serious is this for the president?
I don't think it's serious at all. Manafort, these so-called or alleged financial crimes began a decade ago and really have absolutely nothing to do with President Trump. And the Papadopoulus situation is nothing as well, because he was a volunteer for the campaign. And I think basically what he was an aspiring fixer. There was a movie recently with Richard Gere called The Rise and Fall of the New York Fixer. And I think this kid, and I say he's a kid because he was 30 years old, probably a bit naive, and he probably wanted to be indispensable to Trump. He wanted to be a fixer where he put together Trump with Putin, so he would be the big shot. And I think he had a big ego about it. He was all over the internet talking about he had ties to Trump, that Trump liked him so much. So I think that's what this is really about, is someone who's a volunteer who's trying to make himself seem bigger than he really was. And it just kind of blew up on him because he didn't realize that there was something illegal with trying to do this activity.
Let me put the same then to Susan Glasser. Susan, do you think this is serious for the presidency? And which of these 2 stories, the Papadopoulos one or the other one, which is the more important?
Well, look, first of all, the answer is we don't know yet, but this is the first time since 1974 when the campaign manager for Richard Nixon, John Mitchell, was indicted and charged, that we've had something like this in the United States. So it is most certainly a big deal when the guy who was the campaign chairman for the man who then became the president of the United States is indicted on charges that have to do with influence peddling and that have to do with lying to the U.S. federal government about it during and after the presidential campaign we had last year. So that's one thing. The Papadopoulos revelations, I think, are really the big news in many ways today in Washington, in the sense that it's a total surprise. This is a story nobody knew anything about. It suggests how tightly under wraps this investigation is, and it does bring the Russia collusion story directly inside the Trump campaign in these charges for the first time.
Susan Glasser, one of the theories about all of this is that this is just the start, and the Manafort story is going to turn out to be much bigger because they've got something on him. So now they can start trying to plead with him and to get him to cooperate with them to avoid serious jail sentences or whatever on the charges that are currently facing him. Now, if that happens, don't you go step by step towards the White House itself?
Well, again, we'll see how this unfolds.
Susan first and then Charlotte. Susan quickly and then Charlotte.
the history of prosecutions like this suggests that, in fact, it's a very common tactic to bring charges on financial matters or things like that, and then to build the bigger case slowly. Some of the testimony that's emerged today includes a lawyer for Mueller saying at the plea hearing of George Papadopoulos that this was, in fact, one small part of a very large investigation. Many people here in Washington are wondering very much how close to President Trump it does go. But I think a lot of people feel like it stretches credibility to have the president himself and also his White House spokesperson making such claims from the government podium today about the president having nothing to do with any of this, and making it seem as though the president's own campaign chairman was barely involved with the campaign.
Right.
This is the kind of thing his lawyers would never advise him to do, the president, to get in the middle of commenting on this right now.
Charlotte, don't you worry that this is just a little step, and there are going to be more steps, and they will eventually lead to the White House?
You know, I really don't think so, because I don't think there's any there. And I think that it's very possible that Mueller, who has great authority to take this investigation any way he wants, might even start investigating the Democrats with Podesta, the Podesta Group, with Uranium One, with the dossier that was funded by the Democrats and Hillary Clinton. I mean, it's entirely possible that there could be indictments across both aisles. Or this could be the end of the investigation. Perhaps this is all that Mueller has. So I don't think we really know, and we're just going to have to wait and see.
Well, we will have to wait and see. But Susan, is it the case that Trump supporters, at least for the time being, will say, look, this is just more people trying to obstruct the president from getting on with what the president wants to get on with, and just give the guy a break, get out of the way, and let him be president?
Look, clearly this is what they're saying. Your other guest seems to, have the talking points handout sheet. But I think, you have to judge each piece of this on its own. I think people make a mistake to sort of be pundits when it comes to an investigation that we know very little to nothing about. I think it's clear that these are serious charges that have been filed against Paul Manafort. The scale of the sums involved are eye-popping. You just had a report that was very interesting about your own correspondents reporting in Ukraine. But what he's charged with here in the United States is having $18 million in alleged money laundering flowing through accounts, and an additional $75 million flowing through what amounted to an effort to secretly lobby the U.S. government here in Washington on behalf of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, now deposed, and to cover it up. Those are very serious allegations in and of themselves. And one of the reasons why this Mueller investigation has started with Paul Manafort, it should be noted, is because this investigation was already occurring, and then it got wrapped up in the larger Mueller probe. So again, there is a natural logic to it. And I think, again, we should take it for what it's worth right now. We don't know where Mueller's going
Susan Glasser,
with the probe.
Charlotte Lords, we need to leave it there. Thanks both very much indeed. Thanks.